Hello and welcome to the course Basics of Experimental Design for Cognitive Psychology. I am Ark Verma from the Department of Cognitive Science, IIT Kanpur. This is the 7th week of the course and we are discussing reaction time studies. Before we go forward, let's talk a little bit about where do these studies started. In the previous lecture, I talked to you about the logic and the goals of the of the reaction time studies, but where does this start? So, systematic observation and comparison of response times as a form of scientific inquiry is not new. It goes back to the 19th century in a field that may sort of appear hardly related to psychology. For example, astronomers at the time used what is called the eye and the ear method to for timing and recording stellar transits. All right, so what they were doing was they was basically looking at the movement of star in the field of the telescope, and they listened to and counted the clicks of a clock and then recorded the exact time when the star reaches a particular position in the field of the telescope. So, from point A to point B, they would calculate the time it takes a star to reach from point A to point B, and that is how they used to time it. So, because of this importance of timing and timing accuracy in astronomy, a great deal of research was done in the 19th century to understand individual differences in observation and measurement accuracy. So, this is basically a broad background of where measurement of timing started becoming important. Now, some of this research was picked up by psychologists as well. For example, German physiologist Hermann Helmholtz studied the speed of the sensory nerve conduction by measuring how fast humans responded to stimuli applied to different parts of the body. So, basically they were, and depending upon how far that part of the body was from the brain. Say for example, how fast you would respond when somebody pricks at your toe versus how fast you would respond when somebody pricks at the ear, given the distance of the brain from that body part. However, it was Dutch physiologist Francis Donders who started a new era of reaction time research. Now, Donders was interested in measuring the speed of the mental processes, just like we were describing or talking about in the previous lecture. So, he was more interested in understanding the speed of the mental processes rather than the speed of physical responses. All right. So, he pointed out that if a simple response task is created, just like the one Helmholtz was using, such as responding to a stimulus on the skin, it could consist of a number of steps, only a part of which would basically be the timing of the mental process. So, for example, when you are giving somebody a task and you are expecting them to respond, only part of that response time is mental process, rest would be physical sort of receiving the motor signal and executing that motor signal, and people can be fast and slow in that. So, if the duration from the stimulus to response was considered as a physiological time, the total amount of time for individuals to physically respond to stimulus and the time taken up by the mental process was only a part of the time. So, whatever response time is there, it basically, according to Donders, it was two things. It was first the time of mental process plus time of physically responding. What he wanted to do was he wanted to create situations so that he could isolate the time of the mental process there. All right. So, given that there was this very brief response times that were getting measured in such tasks, for example, these could be as short as 1/7 of a second, it became difficult. He figured out that this was difficult to determine how much time it would have taken the brain to respond to this process, brain to perform this particular computation. So, in order to measure the speed of these mental processes, he developed a new approach. This approach is referred to as the subtraction method, and it is very common, and it is now used not only in reaction time research, but a lot of other kinds of research as well that we will visit in this week and the next one. Now, this subtraction method basically involved the comparison of responses obtained in the different tasks. He described this his reasoning for using this approach in so many words. Let's see. He says, the idea occurred to me to interpose into the process of physiological time some new components of mental action. So, he basically said, okay, if a particular mental action takes so much time, let me add a step or subtract a step from this mental process. If I could investigate how much this would lengthen this physiological time, this would, I judged, reveal the time required for the interposed term. So, whatever step that I have added in this particular sequence. So, how do we do this, or how did Donders propose? He says we can design two tasks such that task A requires all the steps that are required in task B and one additional step. Alright. So, under such a circumstance, what will you do is you will basically expect that it should take longer to complete task A than task B. One can infer how long it takes to complete that specific additional mental process that we have added in task A by subtracting the time taken to complete task B from the time it has taken to complete task A. So, now when you do task B minus task A, you get the time for that specific extra computation that you have added. Alright. Following this reasoning, he used three procedures. In the A method, it was called a simple reaction time task. Here, a participant was asked to respond to a pre-designated stimulus, such as pressing a button as soon as a light was turned on. So, this is a simple reaction time task. In the B method, he used what is called a choice reaction time task. A participant was asked to respond differently to different stimulus. So, for example, use one hand to respond to a red light and use another hand to respond to a white light. So, in the first one, as soon as you see a light, you press a button. In the second one, you basically see which light is turned on, and if red light has come, use this hand, if white light has come, use this hand. Now, you can see in A, there is just a single step. In B, there is a decision that is also involved. Which light has come up, I evaluate, and then I choose my appropriate hand to respond. So, he argued that the B method involved all mental processes required by the A method plus two additional processes. What are those? The distinguishing between the two stimuli or stimulus discrimination, that in this case, which is the color of the light, it is red color or white color, and deciding how to respond, which hand am I going to use based on which light has come up. So, two extra steps in B as compared to A. So, if the participants' reaction time in performing the two tasks, A simple reaction time and B choice reaction time, were compared, they would be expected to take longer in performing a choice reaction time task than a simple reaction time task. And whatever extra time they have taken could be inferred as the time for the two extra steps that were involved, stimulus discrimination and response selection. Now, he said, okay, let's come up with another method. So, he developed a third procedure, the C method, which is sometimes referred to as the selective reaction time task. All right. Now, in selective reaction time task, what would happen is that you could add this to differentiate the time between the two steps. So, what are the two steps? Stimulus discrimination and response selection. So, let's see what the C method is. In C method, the participant is asked to respond to only the light of one color by ignoring the light of other colors. So, for example, respond only when you see a red light, don't respond when you see a white light. So, you can see this C method actually quietly goes in between A and B. Alright. So, this procedure basically requires the participant to discriminate between two stimuli, the two colors of the light, but it does not require response selection because a participant has to respond to one kind of light only. As soon as they decipher that, okay, which kind of task is being used, which kind of light has come on, they just have to know which to respond to or otherwise not. So, response selection, that step is gone from here. For this reason, it could be predicted that it would take less time to complete a selective reaction time task as compared to the choice reaction time task. So, now you have a gradation. You have a simple reaction time task, you have a selective reaction time task, and you have a choice reaction time task. This will take the least amount of time, this will take the second most amount of time, and the choice reaction time task, because it has two steps, will take the most amount of time. So, consequently, what they did was, by comparing the times taken in performing these two tasks, one was able to isolate the time for response choice. So, response selection, how much time does response selection take, as this was the mental process that was involved in the B method, but it was not in the A method. and it was the reason that response times would increase in the order of A and then C and then B. That is basically how these tasks were set up, and you can see they are set up so neatly that you can actually compare. When you compare A and B, you basically get the time difference in selection of responses, and you compare B and C, you basically get the discrimination of light. So you can very well arrange these tasks and know by subtraction of what from what you will get the time taken for a given process. So this is basically from Sternberg. This is just an example of what kind of task you are doing. So this is Donder's setup for 18 for creating reaction time experiments: simple reaction time task, choice reaction time task, and selective reaction time task. This is basically how this is working. So A is light flashes, press the key. B is perceive the left light, then decide which button to basically press, left key, right key, and so on. Now, Donders and his students carried out a large number of similar experiments, and they compared reaction times for the three kinds of tasks. The results generally confirmed their predictions. For example, in a series of vowel repetition experiments, three conditions were included. For example, repeating a vowel as soon as possible while knowing which vowel was going to be presented. So, A, B, A, E, I, O, U, something like that. Repeating a vowel without knowing which vowel has to be presented. So, knowing which vowel has been presented and producing it. C, repeating a pre-designated vowel when the stimuli might include different vowels as well. So, this is the C method. So, you have now A, B and C. He observed that an average of around 201 milliseconds, 284 milliseconds and 237 milliseconds were taken for the three combinations respectively. Based on these results, they were able to infer that the mental process responsible for recognizing a vowel took about 36 milliseconds, and the mental process of making the choice of response took around 47 milliseconds. So, you do either C minus A, which is selective minus simple, or you do B minus C, you get the time for the specific step. Donnert considers the findings that he found and students the first determination of the duration of well-defined neural responses. So, this is novel, and this is sort of a very specialized finding that Donnert and his group is able to demonstrate. Now, with the discovery of the subtraction method, reaction time research could now flourish during the second half of the 19th century, and people like Wilhelm Wundt and his associates at Leipzig laboratory published a large number of reaction times studies related to a variety of mental processes. So, remember, Wilhelm Wundt was the one who formed the first laboratory in psychology in the year 1879, and he was partly inspired from the reaction time research that was conducted, or the protocols that were developed by Francis Donders in the 1800s. Many other leading psychologists of the time also worked on mental chronometry. For example, Cattell's extensive work on the time taken by cerebral operations and Baldwin's comparison of sensory and motor reaction times were all inspired from the kind of protocols that Francis Donders was developing. However, around the turn of the 20th century, reaction time research declines a little bit as a result of the rejection of the subtraction method. Some people started doubting the subtraction method and says they are not, it is not creating correct computations, and therefore, for a long time the method was criticized. Let's look at why it was criticized. First was that the reaction time results obtained with the subtraction method had a great deal of variations between individuals and between laboratories, which basically made it hard to compare and confirm a particular finding, because remember, at this time people did not know a lot about control, and there were a lot of variation probably across conditions and laboratories. The second was, the other had to do with this assumption of pure insertion. Now you see, simple reaction time to selective reaction time to choice reaction time. If we are considering this subtraction as the true indication of what reaction times might tell us, we are basically going with this assumption of pure insertion. What is this assumption of pure insertion? The assumption of pure insertion basically is that adding one step or adding an extra step to the process will not affect the overall thing, but it will affect just that amount of time taken, utilized for that particular step. Actually, some people said that when you make a task more difficult, it increases the overall time and not just the time taken to perform that additive step. And that basically became a very important critique for reaction time research, and which is why it was discontinued for a long time starting the earlier 19th century. Now, around 1950s, reaction time research was revived again with the development of computer technology and with the rise of information processing theory of cognition. So, around 1950s, you see that the information processing metaphor for cognition takes place, where we start talking about inputs and computations and representations, and that is where people found that, okay, reaction time research is one way, it is one tool to basically again delineate steps in information processing for a given stimulus. And that is again around the time where reaction time research started taking up, and a lot of experiments which had to do with evaluating word stimuli, face stimuli, pictures, and so on started being used. So this former, reaction time research, it provided a means for measuring reaction times in a more accurate and reliable way. So now they started using computers. Computers had more precise timing. They had a better way of presenting stimulus. They had a better way of recording response times. And in that sense, a bunch of the problems that were coming in the 1800s, late 1800s, early 1900s, were handled by the presence of good computers, more accurate presentation, and measurement durations. Also, the latter, the information processing theory, as a metaphor, as a framework, it provided a very nice conceptual framework that validated and that necessitated the examination of cognitive processes as happening in discrete stages, in some sense confirming Donder's initial ideas about how mental processes really work. Hick in 1952 and Hyman in 1953, according to Lackman, basically led the way in the survival of the reaction time approach to cognition. But Sternberg's work was one of the ones that basically provided the best illustration of how valid reaction time research was, and it basically overcame the earlier criticisms about this. So let's look at that in some detail. Now, Sternberg endorsed Donder's view that a cognitive task consists of several discrete stages, and reaction times could be used to identify or isolate these stages. All right. He adopted slightly different approach to Donder's. Let us see. Instead of comparing the reaction times to complete tasks involving different stages, Sternberg always used the same experimental task that involved the same number of stages. He said, we will use the same stages. We compare simple reaction time and selective reaction time to examine stimulus discrimination. Let's see how he did it. What he did to identify a given stage was to manipulate a factor that might apply to only one of the stages. So he said, okay, well, I'll not use different tasks, but I'll use some kind of manipulation of a factor within that task. Let us see how that works. Now, by observing how this factor would affect an individual's reaction time, he could infer what stage was involved in a given task and how long it took the participant to complete that method. So he now basically used what is called the additive factor method. Donder's was subtraction. This is an additive factor method. Let us see how this differs. Now, because there was now no need to add an additional stage to study this approach effectively overcame the problem that was attached to this the idea of pure insertion. More specifically, Sternberg adopted an item recognition task to study the cognitive processes involved in memory retrieval. So, we will see what he does. It is a very simple task. The participant had to decide whether a digit presented to them visually was one of the digits that they had seen earlier as well. Okay. The participant's reaction time was measured as the duration between the onset of this digit and the time when the response was given. So, this digit comes and the participant is to tell whether it was presented earlier or not. So, when the digit comes and the participant gives the response, that is the measurement of the reaction time that they are going with. Now, Sternberg postulated that 3 stages are involved in this item recognition task. First is stimulus encoding. So, whatever digit is presented is to be encoded, it has to be compared mentally. Okay, this digit that is presented on screen is 3 or it is 4 or it is 7, something like that. And then comparing this digit, whatever the input is there, with the previously seen digit. So, for example, previously the person might have seen 3, 9 and 8. Now, you have to compare. okay, and basically then come up with a decision that okay, this digit was presented earlier or this digit was not presented earlier. Okay, the encoding part, the comparison with previous presented digits, and the decision and response. Okay, yes, it was presented, or no, it was not presented. Now, in one of his experiments, in one of Sternberg's experiment, the critical manipulation was the number of digits to be remembered. Okay, so he would be giving them some digits earlier before they go into this experiment. Sometimes the digits were 1, sometimes they were 2, sometimes they were up to 6. All right. Now, the experimental task that he was measuring reaction times in was identical for the participants in these 6 conditions. So, the task is exactly the same. You have to see whether this digit was presented earlier or not. Okay, they had to decide. Yeah. So, in this design, the only difference between the 6 conditions is how many digits were presented earlier. Say, for example, if I have shown 3 here and I have presented 3 here, you have to make one match. If I presented 3 here and I have presented 4 here, you have to still make one match. You will get the answer no and you will quickly press. If I presented 3 and 5 here and I presented 4 here, then you have to compare with 3 and compare with 5. Both times you return with a no answer and you give a different response. Okay. So, in this design, the only difference across the 6 conditions is how many comparisons had to be made before a positive or a negative decision can be arrived at. Now, the manipulation of the set size, the previously presented digits, conceivably only affected the comparison stage, because everything else, the decision, response making, etc., will stay the same. This approach allowed Sternberg to determine how much time mental comparison took by comparing the differences in these different conditions, by comparing the differences in reaction time in these different conditions. And because it is the same task almost, this determination was not dependent on pure insertion assumption, okay, because you are not adding an extra step. It is the same number of steps, but the mental comparison has sort of increased. You are comparing with 1 set size or 2 set size or 3 set size worth of digits. This experiment showed that the size of the set, how many you had to go and compare with, and the participants' reaction time actually had a linear relation. So, if you are comparing with 1 versus comparing with 4 versus comparing with 6, the reaction times increased accordingly. Okay. So, the response latencies actually were shown to increase by 38 milliseconds with each increasing digit to be remembered. All right. So, assuming that the individuals had to scan their immediate memory for responding to the stimulus, these results actually offered a very good indication of the speed at which we scan our memory. So, this is this. You are shown 4 digits earlier, 4 alphabets earlier, and then you are shown L. Now, you have to compare this L with all 4 of them, and it basically will take you a certain amount of time. Let us say if each comparison takes 40 milliseconds, it should take you around 160 milliseconds. So, hypothesized stages are encode, compare, decide whether it is present or not, and then respond. Here you can see based on the number of items in the memory step 1 versus 4, that is the exact amount of time these people are taking. He created another experiment as well. In another experiment, Sternberg, what he did was he degraded the digits so that they became slightly harder to recognize. Okay, everything remains the same as the experiment that we have just seen. He reasoned that if stimulus degradation affects the encoding state, see, if you cannot see the stimulus well, it will take you more time to encode. If it takes you more time to encode, this time sort of adds in the overall time that you have to take across the 4 stages: encode, compare, decide, respond. So, if stimulus degradation did affect the encoding stage, then the reaction time would be longer than that on intact stimuli, but the slope representing the relationship will not change. It will still be parallel to that same time. Just the stimulus encoding time has increased, the comparison etc. does not change. But if stimulus degradation affects both encoding and comparison, then the slope would also change. All right. So, the way the responses are, say for example, it was taking 38 milliseconds with every extra digit, it will probably now take 40 milliseconds or 45 or 50 milliseconds in addition for comparison as well. Okay. So, if stimulus degradation would affect both encoding and comparison, then the slope would also be slightly steeper. It will take more time. Thus, by adding an additional factor of stimulus quality, he was able to determine whether encoding and comparison were two independent stages or they sort of competed with each other or interacted with each other. The results of this experiment actually showed that there was little difference in the slopes. So, it basically means there was little difference in the slopes between the degraded and the intact stimuli, thus suggesting that stimulus degrading only affected the initial encoding stage, but did not affect the comparison stages and did not affect basically the final response. So, that basically tells you that just by adding one factor in the stimulus in terms of stimulus quality, he was able to see at what stage of processing does this particular factor affect. Now, obviously, Sternberg's research is also not without problems. It has its own critiques and so on. But it demonstrated that reaction time is still a useful and a valid means for studying the cognitive processes, and therefore it plays a significant role in reviving the use of reaction time research in cognitive science or in cognitive experimental psychology. The impact of Sternberg's reaction time research can be seen in a very interesting comment made by Lachman and colleagues, who says, over the past decade, it has sometimes seemed as though half of cognitive psychologists in North America were devoting themselves to testing Sternberg's theories, testing how mental computations work, how much time they take, and so on. So, in that sense, you can see more than half of the psychologists in North America devoted themselves to conducting reaction time studies. And even now, if you see, a large amount of work in experimental and cognitive psychology basically is contingent on measurement of reaction times, measurement and computation, addition, subtraction of stages, and so on. I will stop here. I will continue this story in the next lecture. Thank you.